St. Mary's Hospital, once the pride of the New York community, now operates like a well-oiled but soulless machine. Under the stringent supervision of Janet Miller, everything runs by the book, yet no one on the staff feels truly inspired. The long hallways, illuminated by cold white lights, echo with the hurried footsteps of nurses and doctors, interspersed with weary, pressure-laden sighs. On Monday morning, Janet was conducting her routine inspection of the waiting area, her familiar clipboard in hand. She stopped by a reception desk where an employee seemed to be struggling to explain something to a man standing across from her. Janet frowned as her eyes caught sight of the bold red cap with the words MAGA emblazoned on it. The man, dressed in a plain gray t-shirt, jeans, and sneakers, seemed entirely out of place in the hospital's professional atmosphere. Janet strode purposefully to the reception desk, her voice sharp. "What's going on here?" The receptionist hesitated. "He wants to walk around the hospital, to observe. I explained that the hospital doesn't allow unauthorized visitors to roam freely, but—" The man smiled and interrupted. "I just want to get a better understanding of how this place operates. No need to worry, I'm not here to bother anyone." Janet fixed her gaze on the man, her tone leaving no room for negotiation. "This is a hospital, not a sightseeing spot, and that hat of yours—" Her eyes flicked briefly to the MAGA logo is inappropriate in a professional environment. If you don't have a legitimate purpose here, I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The man remained calm, his smile unyielding. "It's interesting you mention professionalism. I guess surprises aren't really your thing." Janet scowled. "I don't need surprises. I need order, and the hospital's policies don't include letting outsiders wander around freely." The tension between them was palpable, making the receptionist feel like the air was too thick to breathe. Finally, the man shrugged. "Fair enough. I don't want to disturb anyone, but don't let appearances deceive the truth." Janet watched him leave, his calm demeanor unsettling her. "Another troublemaker," she thought, turning back to the receptionist. "Log his name and reason for being here. I don't want this happening again." The receptionist nodded, but couldn't help glancing after the man. A younger staff member nearby whispered to a colleague, "That looked like Elon Musk." Janet returned to her office, brushing off the incident. She wasn't one to dwell on insignificant encounters. To her, the most important thing was maintaining efficiency. Her computer screen displayed a dashboard of hospital performance metrics. While the number of dissatisfied patients was rising, Janet focused only on revenue and processing times. "We're still operating efficiently. That's what matters," she reassured herself. But as Janet buried herself in spreadsheets, the atmosphere in the hospital began to shift. Rumors about the mysterious man spread like wildfire. "Are you sure that was really Elon Musk? Who else wears a MAGA hat and stays that composed? I bet he's planning something big." If it's true, Janet's in for a bad day. What they didn't know was that the man would return, and his presence would unravel everything Janet had built her beliefs upon. Tuesday morning at St. Mary's Hospital began as usual. Janet Miller, the hospital administrator, was on site by 7 a.m., clipboard in hand, ready to tackle the day's objectives. She walked the hallways, her sharp gaze scanning each area to ensure everything was in order and running smoothly. However, once again, Janet's plans were disrupted early on. From the reception desk, a small group of staff had gathered, whispering amongst themselves. Janet frowned. She despised disorder and distractions during work hours. But as she approached, what she saw stopped her in her tracks. The man in the red MAGA hat from yesterday was back. Elon Musk. With his characteristic air of nonchalance, he nodded at the receptionist and held a sheet of paper, as if he had every right to be there. Janet felt her face flush with anger. He's back again? Who let this happen? She strode forward, the sharp clicks of her heels echoing off the tiled floor. What are you doing here? Janet's voice was cold and authoritative. The whispers around them ceased immediately. The nearby staff stepped back, instinctively avoiding the rising tension. Elon glanced up from the paper, smiling. Good morning. I just came back to finish what I started yesterday. Do you mind if I take a closer look around? Janet narrowed her eyes, his calm demeanor only fueling her irritation. I made myself very clear yesterday. You're not allowed to wander this hospital. This is not a place for sightseeing. And that hat, I don't want to see it here. Elon calmly removed the hat, holding it in his hand. This hat bothers you, doesn't it? But I don't think it's affecting any patients or staff, is it? Janet crossed her arms, feeling her grip on the situation slipping. She glanced around, noticing several employees discreetly watching the exchange. Her voice dropped, still sharp, but more measured. You're wasting our time. This is a professional healthcare facility, not a venue for your personal ideas. Elon tilted his head, his gaze sharp yet affable. You think I'm making a statement? That's interesting. I don't see observing and understanding how a system operates as a personal statement. Don't you think listening should always come first? For a brief moment, Janet was at a loss for words, but she quickly regained control. You have no business here. If you don't have a valid reason, I'll have security escort you. Out again. Elon smiled, showing no signs of defiance. He turned to the receptionist and spoke in a calm tone. I apologize for any inconvenience I've caused. Thank you for your patience. But before leaving, he turned back to Janet, his gaze penetrating. You know, the thing about systems is that we often focus so much on control that we forget. They only truly work when they serve people. Thank you for reminding me of that. Janet watched as he walked out the main doors, feeling as though she had lost something she couldn't quite name. Still, she pushed the unease aside and turned to the receptionist. Record his name and purpose for being here. I don't want this happening again. The receptionist nodded, though her eyes lingered on Elon's retreating figure. Nearby, a young doctor, Mark Robinson, couldn't hold back his curiosity and whispered to a colleague, That's definitely Elon Musk. Did you see the way he spoke? The way he carried himself? It has to be him. Emily Turner, a veteran nurse standing nearby, furrowed her brow. If it really is him, why would he be here? What could he possibly want with this hospital? Mark shrugged, his expression uneasy. There's only one way to find out. Wait and see what happens. But I bet Janet just walked into something bigger than she realizes. In her office, Janet tried to focus on the endless tasks on her clipboard. She reviewed performance reports, determined to regain her sense of control. But no matter how hard she tried, the image of the man in the red hat kept intruding on her thoughts. His calm demeanor, piercing gaze, and cryptic words left her feeling unsettled. Systems only work when they serve people. Janet shook her head, muttering to herself, Just a troublemaker, nothing to worry about. But what she couldn't know was that the man would return, and this time he wouldn't leave so easily. That afternoon, the atmosphere at St. Mary's Hospital was thick with unease. Since the strange man wearing a MAGA hat had appeared that morning, whispers had been spreading like wildfire. Nurses and doctors murmured to each other in the hallways, their expressions a mix of worry and curiosity. Some believed he was just a troublemaker, while others were convinced it's Elon Musk. Janet Miller sat in her office, trying to ignore the commotion. She reassured herself that he was nothing more than a show-off, not worth her attention. "Who cares who he is? This hospital is mine, and I know how to run it best," she thought. Yet deep down, a flicker of unease remained. His words from earlier that morning about a system that serves people echoed in her mind. At precisely 2:30 p.m., the phone on Janet's desk rang. Her assistant was on the other end, her voice uneasy and tense. "Mrs. Miller, there's an emergency meeting in the main conference room at 3 p.m. All senior leaders are required to attend." Janet frowned, her worry starting to grow. "What's this meeting about? I didn't receive any prior notice," she asked, her tone slightly impatient. "The hospital's new owner has requested it, ma'am, and I think you should be prepared," the assistant replied, her voice trailing off. Janet's heartbeat quickened slightly. A new owner? She'd heard rumors about St. Mary's being acquired by a major corporation, but she never imagined it would affect her directly. Still, Janet maintained her composure. She gathered her documents and made her way to the conference room, reassuring herself it's probably just an orientation meeting, nothing to worry about. The main conference room was brightly lit, and all the senior leaders were already seated. Janet entered, her face a mask of calm authority, the sharp clack of her heels echoing on the polished floor. Her eyes scanned the room until they froze on the man seated at the head of the table. Elon Musk. Gone was the familiar red MAGA hat. Instead, Elon wore a crisp suit that managed to look both polished and characteristically understated. He sat casually, a hint of humor flickering in his gaze as he looked at Janet, as though they were old acquaintances. Janet's stride faltered momentarily, but she quickly regained her usual poise, walking to her seat as if unaffected by the murmurs and curious stares of her colleagues. Why is he here? What does this mean? She wondered, keeping her thoughts to herself. Elon rose from his seat, his gaze sweeping across the room before he spoke. "Thank you all for coming. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Elon Musk. As of last week, I'm officially the majority shareholder of St. Mary's Hospital." The room fell silent, as if the very air had been sucked out. Janet felt her heart skip a beat, then begin pounding faster. His words hit her like a thunderclap. What did he just say? Majority shareholder? St. Mary's belongs to him now? Elon continued, his voice calm but firm. "I didn't acquire this hospital because it's a valuable asset. I believe the healthcare sector needs a radical transformation. We can't allow an outdated system to continue burdening both staff and patients. I want St. Mary's to become a symbol of change, a place where people come first." He began pacing around the table, his tone steady, but his piercing gaze missing nothing. However, from what I've observed over the past 2 days, it's clear that not everyone here understands this vision. Some seem more focused on control than on service. That needs to change. Janet felt every eye in the room shift toward her. Her throat went dry, but she maintained her outward composure. Inside, a storm of anger and confusion churned. "He's targeting me. Who does he think he is?" Elon stopped walking and looked directly at Janet, his eyes seeming to pierce through her calm exterior. "Mrs. Miller," he said, his voice measured yet weighty, "I've heard about your leadership style. I understand you keep everything tightly managed, with procedures followed to the letter. But let me ask you this. Does your leadership make employees and patients feel heard?" Janet tightened her grip on the clipboard in her hands, feeling cornered. Taking a deep breath, she responded sharply, "Mr. Musk, I believe that strict procedures are the only way to run a hospital efficiently. We're doing the best we can in an incredibly challenging environment." Elon nodded slightly, a faint smile playing on his lips. "Efficient? Perhaps. But does that efficiency translate into satisfaction for patients and staff? Or is it just numbers on your reports?" Janet felt a surge of anger rise. She wasn't accustomed to being challenged, especially not in front of her peers. "We've kept this hospital running for years, and it works just fine. I don't see any need for drastic changes," she replied, her voice firm. Elon paused, his gaze sharpening further. "You don't see a need for change, or you don't want to change. Because if we don't adapt, you'll soon find that the current way of doing things no longer works. Remember, this hospital exists not just to operate. It exists to serve people, and that has to start with you." He returned to his seat, ending his remarks with a brief but weighty statement. "Mrs. Miller, you have time to show that you can adapt, but know this, if you don't, I'll find someone who can." Janet remained silent, her lips pressed tightly together as humiliation and rage simmered within her. As she left the room, her mind raced. "No one has the right to dictate how I run things. We'll see who changes whom." Janet walked out of the conference room feeling the weight of every employee's gaze on her. The familiar hospital corridor now seemed oppressively narrow, though she maintained her composure. Janet could sense the unusual tension in the air. Elon Musk's words echoed relentlessly in her mind. "You have time to prove you can change." She quickly headed to her office, trying to dismiss the intrusive thoughts, but as she entered, closed the door behind her, and sat down, she realized she couldn't ignore what had just happened. Musk hadn't just challenged her authority, he had made her feel like the center of a much larger issue, one she'd never fully acknowledged. Janet opened her laptop, staring at the performance report. The numbers were steady as usual. Processes ran smoothly, revenue targets were met, but somewhere between the lines and the charts, Janet knew something was amiss. Negative feedback from staff and patients was increasing. Many employees had resigned and team morale was plummeting. But Janet, as always, had dismissed these warnings, believing efficiency was the only thing that mattered. Her eyes landed on a small photo in the corner of her desk. It was a picture of her with her parents on her medical school graduation day. Janet's radiant smile in the photo seemed like a distant reminder of who she used to be. Her father, a retired physician, had told her the night before she received her medical license. "You became a doctor, not just to be the best. You did this to help people." Those words had once been her guiding principle, but she couldn't pinpoint exactly when she had lost her way. Was it after the biggest mistake of her life? The day a poor decision in the operating room had cost a patient his life? The memory resurfaced vividly. A middle-aged man involved in a car accident, the panicked face of his wife waiting outside the operating room, and the moment Janet realized her error was irreversible. Though she faced no legal repercussions, the pain and guilt never left her. Janet had left the operating room soon after, believing management would shield her from facing similar mistakes. But now, she questioned whether that approach was simply a way to run from her own fears. Outside her office, the hospital operated as usual, but Janet realized she didn't truly know what was happening in its corridors. Did the staff feel heard? Were patients receiving the best care? Or was it all just numbers in a report, a facade masking the truth that trust had eroded among everyone in the building? She walked to the window and looked down at the hospital courtyard. A group of nurses was pushing an elderly patient in a wheelchair, laughing and chatting with him. Janet suddenly realized how long it had been since she personally spoke to her staff or stepped into a patient's room to hear their stories. Elon Musk's words echoed again. A system only works if it serves people. Janet closed her eyes, feeling the cracks in her hardened exterior. The confidence that had once been her armor now felt like a burden. The next morning, Janet arrived at the hospital earlier than usual, but instead of heading straight to her office, she walked through the reception area where nurses and staff were, preparing for the day. Glances darted her way, quickly shifting as she approached. Janet knew they feared her. Not respect. Fear. That realization stung more than she expected. Janet decided to start small. Talking. She approached a nurse reviewing patient files, her tone as natural as she could muster. "Sarah, I heard you had to work overtime yesterday. Was there an issue with the shift?" Sarah was startled, looking at Janet with surprise. She had never seen her manager show interest in staff this way. "Oh, nothing major. Just an emergency case that needed handling. But I managed." "Thank you. I really appreciate your effort," Janet said, a faint smile crossing her face. Sarah didn't know how to respond. Janet usually appeared only when there was a problem or to deliver criticism, but this time she simply expressed gratitude. Sarah nodded slightly and returned to her work, feeling an unusual sense of something changing. Janet continued moving through the hospital, speaking with a few more staff members and listening to their stories. Each conversation, no matter how brief, felt like a small step on a path she knew she had to take. That evening, back in her office, Janet opened a notebook and began writing. She recorded what she had heard from staff, patient feedback she had previously dismissed. Everything. These were no longer numbers, but stories. Janet no longer felt the pressure to prove anything to Elon Musk. Instead, she realized this change wasn't just about saving her position, it was about reclaiming the person she once was. She set the pen down, her gaze resolute. Janet knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time in years, she felt like she was heading in the right direction. Janet walked into the hospital the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The corridors were as busy as ever, filled with the hurried movements of nurses and doctors, the sound of patients being called, and the rhythmic hum of medical machines. But this time, Janet didn't simply walk through. She paused, observing. She noticed the weary faces, the urgency in people's eyes, and the occasional heavy sighs she had often ignored. She resolved to understand the challenges everyone was facing more deeply. As Janet passed the reception area, staff members glanced at her, their expressions a mix of curiosity and hesitation. She greeted a few of them, something she rarely did before. Some looked surprised, even skeptical. Janet knew trust would not be rebuilt overnight, but she wasn't about to stop trying. She headed toward the meeting room where the department heads were waiting. The room was filled with familiar faces, the head nurse, the chief physician, and the administrative manager, among others. These were people who had worked alongside Janet for years, but most saw her as a strict manager rather than a teammate. Typically, Janet began these meetings with directives, but today she sat down and spoke with an unexpected calmness. "I want to hear from you," she said. "Tell me what's really happening and what changes you need to work better." The room fell silent. Mark Robinson, the youngest doctor in the group, glanced around before speaking up. "The current workload is overwhelming," he said. "We're asking nurses and doctors to work around the clock without adequate rest. I've seen colleagues burn out, and some have left because they just couldn't handle it anymore." Another department head, Emily Turner, added, "We've raised this issue several times. We understand resources are limited, but if this isn't addressed, I'm afraid the staffing shortage will only get worse." Janet listened attentively, taking careful notes. She didn't interrupt or dismiss their concerns, a stark contrast to her usual approach of rebutting ideas that didn't align with her plans. Her demeanor surprised the room. The meeting ran longer than usual as Janet made sure every voice was heard. When it concluded, she stood and said, "I hear you, and I understand I haven't been listening enough in the past. Starting today, I want to work with you to make changes. I need your support to turn today's words into real actions." The department heads exchanged glances. Some nodded, while others remained silent. Janet didn't expect instant trust, but she felt she had laid the foundation for something new. Leaving the meeting, Janet decided to visit the emergency department, the busiest part of the hospital and a place she rarely went unless there was a major issue. As she entered, she was struck by the chaos, the beeping of machines, the shouts of nurses calling for help, and the frustrated murmurs of patients. In the center of the room, Emily Turner was helping an elderly patient move from a hospital bed to a wheelchair. Janet noticed Emily signaling for assistance, but everyone was too busy. Without hesitation, Janet stepped forward. "Let me help," Janet said, her voice firm. Emily turned, her eyes wide with surprise. "Mrs. Miller, you want to help?" "Yes," Janet replied, steadying the wheelchair. "You focus on the patient. I'll make sure nothing goes wrong." Both Emily and the patient seemed bewildered, but Janet remained patient. Together, they managed to get the patient seated safely. When they were done, Emily looked at Janet, still in disbelief. "Are you serious about this?" Emily asked softly. "I don't know what I was thinking before," Janet admitted, her tone gentle yet resolute. "But now I know this is what needs to be done. If I want people to trust me, I have to start with the small things." Emily's expression softened. She didn't say much, but Janet could sense that a small part of the trust she had lost was beginning to return. That afternoon, Janet made a decision she would never have considered before: to hold an open meeting for all staff members. From doctors and nurses to janitorial staff, Janet wanted to hear the stories and opinions she had neglected for so long. As employees trickled into the room, the air was thick with skepticism and curiosity. Janet stood in the center, facing dozens of questioning eyes. "I know that in the past, many of you have felt unheard," she began. "I know I've focused too much on processes and forgotten that this hospital exists to serve people, not just our patients, but all of you. Today, I'm here to listen. Tell me what you need, and I will do everything I can to make things better." A heavy silence filled the room until Richard, an elderly janitor, stood up from the back. "I've worked here for 30 years. This is the first time I've heard you say something like this. If you're serious about changing, I'll believe you," he said, his voice raspy but sincere. Richard's words seemed to break the tension. Other employees began nodding, and a few stepped forward to share their thoughts. Janet stood there, feeling the divide between her and the staff begin to shrink. She knew this journey wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, she felt she was moving in the right direction. As Janet left the room, her eyes wandered down the familiar hallways. Though the hospital remained as busy and chaotic as ever, she realized the change had already begun, not just in how the hospital functioned, but within herself. Janet felt she had taken a small yet meaningful step toward earning back the trust of her team and, perhaps, her own self-respect. The first rays of dawn broke over St. Mary's Hospital, and the facility was already bustling as usual. Janet Miller arrived earlier than usual, carrying a firm resolve to continue her journey of transformation. She had meticulously prepared a new plan for the day, to keep listening to her staff and directly assist wherever needed. But before she could implement her plan, an urgent call from reception upended everything. "Mrs. Miller, we have an emergency," a hurried voice crackled over the phone. "There's been a major accident on the highway. Ambulances are bringing in dozens of patients. The emergency department is about to be overwhelmed." Janet froze for a moment, feeling the tension in the caller's voice. She knew this would be a significant challenge, not just for the hospital but for herself, especially as she had recently declared a commitment to change her leadership style. Taking a deep breath, she replied firmly, "I'll be right down." As she entered the emergency department, chaos engulfed her senses. Ambulance sirens wailed outside while inside, nurses and doctors rushed to prepare beds, equipment, and supplies. The scene was a flurry of motion, with no one pausing for even a moment. Janet didn't stand back to observe as she might have in the past. She headed straight to the heart of the action, where veteran nurse Emily Turner was coordinating the team. "Emily, what's the situation?" Janet asked with a steady voice. Emily turned, surprised to see Janet there. "We're trying to set up more beds and equipment, but with this many patients, I'm not sure it'll be enough." "I'm here to help. Tell me what I can do," Janet replied, her gaze resolute. Emily hesitated for a moment before nodding. "We need more space. Some of the less critical patients can be moved upstairs. Can you coordinate with the other departments?" Janet immediately picked up a phone, calling department heads to free up beds on the upper floors and arrange for stable patients to be transferred. Within minutes, staff began moving patients to create room for those needing urgent care. Janet felt a surge of satisfaction seeing her directives quickly implemented. The first stretchers arrived. A man with a severe head injury groaned in pain, while a young mother clutched her son tightly, both visibly shaken. Janet approached the mother, kneeling to meet her eyes. "Everything is going to be okay. Your son is being taken care of. We'll do everything we can to ensure you're both safe," Janet reassured her, her tone calm and soothing. The mother, tears brimming in her eyes, nodded. "Thank you. I'm so scared," she stammered. "You don't need to worry. Let us handle this," Janet replied, gently placing a hand on the woman's shoulder. As Janet stood up, she noticed Emily watching her with a look of surprise. "I didn't think I'd see you doing this," Emily murmured. Janet smiled and replied, "I'm not just trying, Emily. I need to do this. For you. For this hospital." Hours passed as the emergency department was inundated with patients, and staff worked tirelessly without pause. Janet stayed in the thick of it, helping triage patients, assisting nurses with supplies, and even cleaning up when necessary. She realized that leading a team meant becoming an integral part of it. Mark Robinson, a young doctor, was attending to a patient with a fractured arm. His face glistened with sweat as his hands worked methodically. Janet approached, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Mark, have you eaten yet?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Mark looked up, surprised. "No, but I'm fine. There's too much to do." "No, you need a break. I'll have someone else take over here," Janet said, not leaving room for argument. Mark hesitated briefly before nodding. "Thank you," he said, stepping away for a much-needed rest. Janet watched him leave, feeling a sense of relief. She understood now that caring for her team was as crucial as caring for the patients. An exhausted team couldn't perform at its best. By late afternoon, the chaos began to subside. Critical patients had been treated, and less urgent cases were directed to waiting areas or transferred upstairs. Janet's body ached, but her heart was full. For the first time in years, she felt she had truly contributed, not by issuing commands, but by immersing herself in the work alongside her team. A young nurse approached Janet as the situation stabilized. "You surprised me today, Mrs. Miller. We really needed to see this side of you." Janet smiled, exhaustion evident on her face. "I needed to see this side of myself, too," she replied softly. That evening, back in her office, Janet didn't open her laptop as she usually did. Instead, she sat quietly by the window, gazing at the hospital grounds. The lights from the patient rooms shone brightly in the darkness, a poignant reminder that the work here never truly ended. Yet Janet didn't feel the usual weight of pressure. She had faced a significant crisis and realized that leadership wasn't about control from above, but about being present and involved. Her eyes gleamed with determination as she stood. Today's crisis was just the beginning. She knew that to create lasting change, she would need to maintain what she had done, not just during emergencies, but every single day. And, for the first time, Janet believed she could. Janet Miller arrived at St. Mary's Hospital the next morning with an unusual feeling. The way the staff looked at her had shifted. Their gazes were no longer filled with avoidance or discomfort. Instead, there was a reserved curiosity, as if they were trying to determine whether this famously strict manager could truly change. Janet didn't blame them for their doubt. She knew she needed to do more than just make promises. Janet's first step that day was to call a meeting with all the department heads. This wasn't going to be the usual meeting where she issued directives and expected compliance. This time, Janet sat in the middle of the room with a notebook in front of her and an expression that signaled she was ready to listen. When the department heads settled in, Janet began. "Yesterday, we faced a major crisis. I'm proud of all of you and our entire team for getting through it together. But I realized something. We're not as prepared as we need to be. If we don't improve the way we work, these crises will keep happening. And next time, it could be worse. I need your help to understand what we can do to make this hospital not only function better, but become a place where people want to work and be cared for." The room fell silent. No one spoke immediately. The department heads seemed taken aback by Janet's new approach. In the past, she would have simply issued orders and expected everyone to follow. Now, she was inviting their input. Finally, Emily Turner, the head nurse, broke the silence. "We need to start with the schedules. Right now, nurses and doctors are working too many hours. People are exhausted, with no time for their families. If we don't ease the pressure, we're going to keep losing our best people." Mark Robinson, a young doctor, nodded in agreement. "I concur. Yesterday, I saw colleagues so drained they could barely focus. If we don't address this soon, the consequences could be severe." Janet carefully noted each comment. As the meeting continued, other issues were raised: a shortage of medical equipment, the need to improve communication between departments, and, most significantly, creating a more supportive work environment. Some department heads even pointed out that Janet's rigid leadership style had contributed to the current problems. Janet didn't argue. She just listened. As the meeting drew to a close, Janet looked each person in the room in the eye and said, "I know we can't fix everything in one day, but I'm committed to doing everything I can to improve things. You're not just my staff, you're my teammates. We'll do this together." The room was quiet for a long moment. A few people nodded in agreement, but Janet could see skepticism lingered. She didn't blame them. Trust couldn't be built with words alone. She would have to act. That afternoon, Janet approved a pilot program to reduce overtime hours for nurses and doctors. To make this possible, she requested the hiring of part-time staff to help share the workload. She also installed a new internal communication system to streamline coordination between departments, especially during emergencies. But Janet didn't stop at technical reforms. She understood that true change required addressing how the hospital treated staff often overlooked. She organized an open meeting exclusively for custodians, security guards, and receptionists, the people often considered support staff, but whose roles were vital. The meeting took place in a small but cozy room. Janet entered without a clipboard or charts, just her notebook. She invited each person to share their thoughts, surprising many of them. An older custodian, Mr. Richard, stood up and said, "I've worked here for over 30 years. This is the first time I feel like someone's listening to me. Usually, we just do our jobs and stay out of the way, but today, I feel like maybe we matter too." Richard's words moved Janet deeply. She realized that meaningful change didn't just come from grand reforms, but also from small acts, like taking the time to listen. Janet didn't stop with staff. She also wanted to understand patients' experiences. She organized a meeting with long-term patients and their families to gather feedback. A young mother shared a story about her daughter. "My daughter was admitted with a chronic illness. One nurse cared for her so compassionately, but I could see how exhausted she was, barely able to stand. I think if the hospital took better care of its staff, they could take even better care of us." These words hit Janet like a dagger to the heart. She knew her responsibility wasn't just to improve patient care, but to create an environment where employees felt supported and respected. In the weeks that followed, Janet's reforms began to make a difference. Nurses smiled more in the hallways. Doctors no longer worked endless overtime. One day, Emily Turner stopped by Janet's office and said, "You're really changing things. I don't know what brought this about, but we appreciate it." Janet smiled. She knew this wasn't about proving herself to Elon Musk or anyone else. She was doing it for herself, her team, and the patients she had sworn to serve. That evening, as Janet returned to her office, she found a letter from Elon Musk waiting on her desk. In it, he wrote, "I've heard about what you're doing. I'm impressed. Keep up the good work. Change is never easy, but I believe you're capable of seeing it through." Janet folded the letter, her eyes filled with determination. She knew the journey had just begun, but she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. St. Mary's Hospital was no longer just a workplace for Janet. It had become part of the change she wanted to create in herself and the world around her. Over time, St. Mary's Hospital underwent a remarkable transformation. The reforms initiated by Janet Miller didn't just revolutionize operations. They revived the spirit of the entire team. The once somber, stress-filled hallways now echoed with laughter and conversations. The healthcare staff no longer worked like machines, but as a family, united in overcoming challenges together. Janet was no longer confined to her office, isolating herself from others as she had in the past. Instead, she frequently roamed different departments, engaging with nurses, doctors, janitors, and patients alike. Gone were the days of her clutching a clipboard filled with endless task lists. Instead, she carried a small notebook where she recorded people's thoughts and stories. She understood that the strength of an organization wasn't solely in its efficiency, but in the connections and understanding between its people. One day, Janet received a notification that Elon Musk would be visiting the hospital. Months had passed since his initial appearance, and she recognized the visit as a critical milestone, not only to evaluate the reforms, but to prove that her team had made a real difference. That morning, Janet prepared meticulously, not with detailed reports or elaborate presentations, but by ensuring that every corner of the hospital reflected its newfound sense of community. She didn't want to showcase a facade of perfection, but wanted Elon to see the genuine essence of St. Mary's, a place brimming with life and hope. When Elon arrived, there was no fanfare or grand ceremony. Dressed in a simple suit, he walked into the main lobby with a quiet yet confident smile. Janet greeted him at the entrance, shook his hand, and led him on a tour of the hospital. They began in the pediatric ward, where Janet introduced him to the nurses and doctors. A young nurse named Megan shared, "Since the changes were implemented, my work feels so much more meaningful. The flexible schedule allows me to spend time with my family, which makes me more effective at my job. I truly appreciate what Mrs. Miller has done for us." Elon nodded, glancing at Janet with approval. "This is exactly what I hoped for when I decided to invest in this place," he said. In the emergency department, Janet introduced Elon to Emily Turner, a veteran nurse who had witnessed the hospital's major transformations firsthand. Emily recounted, "I've worked here for over 20 years. There was a time when the stress felt unbearable, and I considered leaving. But now I feel heard and supported, not just by Mrs. Miller, but by the entire team. We work together like a family." Elon smiled. "Leadership isn't about control, it's about service. What I see here at St. Mary's is a testament to that, and it's truly commendable." Janet didn't say anything, only nodding in agreement. She knew Elon's praise wasn't just for her, but for the entire team. In the afternoon, Elon held a meeting with all hospital staff in the large auditorium. The room was packed, the atmosphere a mix of anticipation and excitement. When Elon took the stage, the room fell silent. "When I acquired St. Mary's Hospital, I saw potential," Elon began, "but that potential could only be realized through the right leadership and a spirit of collaboration. I want to extend my heartfelt thanks to Mrs. Janet Miller, who has not only transformed management, but also reshaped how we see each other. She's not just a leader, she's an inspiration." The applause was thunderous, prolonged as if it would never end. Janet, seated in the front row, felt her heart race. Elon gestured for her to join him on stage. Janet hesitated briefly before rising to her feet, walking to the stage amidst the unceasing applause. Taking the microphone, she looked out at the crowded auditorium, at the people she once regarded as subordinates but now saw as companions. "I don't know what to say," Janet began, her voice trembling with emotion. "When I started this journey, I didn't realize how much I could change, or be changed. I've learned that true transformation doesn't come from one person, but from unity and trust. I want to thank all of you for giving me this opportunity, for your patience, and for standing with me as we rebuilt St. Mary's. This isn't my achievement, it's ours. The audience rose to their feet, applause echoing through the hall. Janet felt her eyes sting with tears, but she smiled. This moment wasn't hers alone. It belonged to everyone who had contributed to the change. Later that evening, Janet walked through the hospital's hallways, the soft yellow lights casting a warm glow on the pristine white walls. In the pediatric ward, she saw a little girl playing with building blocks on her hospital bed. Janet stepped inside and sat beside her. "What are you building?" Janet asked with a gentle smile. "A house," the girl replied, her tiny hands carefully placing each block. "Your house looks beautiful. May I help?" Janet asked. The girl shook her head. "I can do it myself, but if you want, you can sit here with me." Janet smiled, sitting quietly beside her. She said nothing more, simply observing the child. In that moment, Janet felt a peace she hadn't experienced in years. As she left the room and looked out the window, the hospital courtyard bathed in the golden hues of the setting sun, Janet knew the journey of transformation wasn't just about St. Mary's, it was about herself. She had learned that leadership wasn't about control, but about understanding and serving. And St. Mary's, once a rigid system, had become a vibrant community filled with hope and humanity. Standing by the window, Janet felt pride, not in her accomplishments but in the people of this hospital, who'd come together to make a difference. This wasn't an ending, but a new beginning, where St. Mary's would continue to shine as a beacon, not just through reforms, but through the hearts of everyone within its walls. St. Mary's Hospital was no longer just a place of healing, but a symbol of unity, empathy, and compassion. Janet Miller's journey wasn't just a lesson in leadership, but proof that when we courageously face our mistakes, humbly listen, and prioritize people, miracles can happen. The story of Janet and St. Mary's is a reminder that no one is perfect, but everyone has the capacity to change and grow. It's a journey not just for ourselves, but for those around us, our colleagues, our families, and those who need us most. If this story touched your heart, please share it to spread this beautiful message. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear more inspiring stories. Together, we can build a better world, a journey that begins with understanding and kindness.